We've got, I'd like to give us 30 minutes if everyone agrees, but let's start off with opening the floor to our audience, both here and online. I'll take 3 or 4 questions, and I hope Ashley is still with us. I'll refer questions to Ashley and we'll bring him back online if we have some for him. So please state your name and organization or affiliation if you have one, and keep your comments brief and to the point. Thank you. Okay.
Yes, my name is Virginie Lacroix.
Sorry, can you speak up?
Yes, my name is Virginie Lacroix. Can you hear me? Yes. My question is simple. It is clear that in the research it appears that AIDS and the international community is not doing enough to protect the population during armed conflict. But I would have you asked the question that do the people feel that it would have been worse without aid worker in the field, without protection program, or do they think that it is just useless and there is no sense to use protection the way we're doing it until now?
Okay, thank you. Samir.
Thanks. Samir from the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI. Thanks to everyone for really interesting presentations, and I think the study is really interesting. I think that something that was quite striking and that came out to me was how diverse and broad the definition of protection come across in the different case studies, from prevention to physical security to food security, preventing diseases, to psychosocial support, providing music, beauty products. And I guess one concern that I have is that if we kind of think of protection in such a broad sense, are we not, in a sense, it's not really surprising that the international actors have failed to provide protection, because we're ultimately asking them to transform these societies, often from a state of conflict to one in which there's effective policing, where there's economic security for its citizens, where there's effective social and healthcare systems. And so I guess my question is that if we take such a broad, multidimensional definition of protection rather than focusing on immediate survival mechanisms, are we not simply setting the international protection regime up for failure?
Thank you very much. Very interesting question. This gentleman here, and then we'll take one more. That'll give us 4 to start with.
My name is Salam Tutu from Nuba Mountains, Solidarity Abroad. I came from one of the study area in South Kordofan. I have a comment and question. My comment, I totally agree with one of the speaker, Justin, about to separate this different kind of protection, for example, physical protection from other type of protection, humanitarian. This actually is not work. For example, in the area, when the security level reach level 4 or level 5, all the humanitarian and all other international activity will stop. So what will happen to the local community after that? So, and even there is no alternative. There is no alternative plan after the security level reach level 5. Then all the organizations that work in the area will be evacuated, and even the UN, they stop. So what will happen for the community after that? This is exactly what happened recently in Nuba Mountains during this war. The security area reached level 5, even people being killed in front of this UNMS offices, and the UNMS staff cannot do anything because they don't have a mandate to make any changes. Is there any recommendations during this study to change this kind of this global protection for the local people? Because really this doesn't work, especially in my area, South Kordofan. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a gentleman back here, and then I don't know if we have anyone online yet, Malcolm. Okay.
Louis Lillywhite, Chatham House. Interested in the debate about arming villagers. One of the major contributions to the perceived success of the Malaysian emergency was arming villages so that they provided self-protection, and the recognition that no external force could provide the necessary protection to those people. So the concept of arming villages is not new. It was done in the 50s and 60s. That was the comment. I've got a question. And once again, I see this conflict between the desires of the local people and the aims of the international community. How are we going to reconcile the two? How are we going to take account and give weight to what the locals want, particularly when it is not as easy as perhaps some of the examples we've heard today, but when the values of the locals may be at odds with those of the wider international community? It's a question that is much wider than just this, I think.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start with those, and I think I'm going to ask Ashley if we still have him online. I don't know, can we bring him up on screen? Or?
Yes, I'm here.
You're there, okay. And shall I mute? Shall I? Oh, okay. Right,
Thank
Ashley,
you.
would you like, yes, you can, would you like to respond to any or all of those questions, bearing in mind that we have a limited amount of time?
I've been given the hot potato, which I will pass on to my colleagues in a moment. I feel unqualified to respond to many of those comments and questions. But just a couple of comments. Picking up on the gentleman from Chatham House, I think this is a huge issue. Yes, rephrasing his question, perhaps this is relating to the differences between the liberal democratic agendas coming out of the Enlightenment project, which historically have shaped international human rights and humanitarian law, notwithstanding the claims of those values to be universal, and local cultures, particularly in non-Western countries, which may be, to a certain extent, dissonant with supposedly universal values. And this is a huge issue, of course, that relates to many areas of political and aid intervention. I guess I would just add one further comment to that, which is to say, he started off by talking about the desires of local people, and I think it's also important to ask who represents communities. As I mentioned in my presentation, to talk about the local voice is of course too simplistic, and in conflict-affected contexts such as Southeast Burma, where there are a number of armed groups, civil society and political organisations seeking to represent a particular community, in this case the Karen. I think there are very serious questions about which voices are listened to and the manner in which international assistance, if it is provided through partnership with one among several potential parties to the conflict, notwithstanding the best intentions of aid agencies, serves to legitimise and support a particular view of what the Karen nation is in this context, a particular view of what local people want and believe, perhaps whilst excluding others. So that would be one point. And just another comment while I'm online is that in that context of armed conflict affected Southeast Burma, people will perhaps be aware that there are provisional ceasefires have been agreed between the KNU and several other armed ethnic groups and the government in Myanmar. It's quite possible that should these ceasefires be confirmed and consolidated, that humanitarian space will open up. International organisations will gain access to areas they were previously unable to operate in. In my presentation, I talked about the fact that CBOs and community-based organisations are often already on the ground in these areas where internationals, at least until now, have lacked access. I think, of course, any increase in aid would be welcome given the huge needs in these areas, but there are dangers that an influx of foreign assistance could distort local priorities, could overwhelm existing local capacities, and actually marginalise some of those local networks that are there on the ground. So I think this raises questions and really shows the importance of engaging with local communities and CBOs. And I think a good entry point is to ensure that local voices and national NGOs, which are not necessarily the same thing, are engaged in context and needs analysis from the outset, rather than outsiders coming in, doing the needs analysis, and then trying to elicit community participation in implementing programs. Locals need to be brought in from the outset, including discussing the basic design of programs, the methodology of needs analysis. Also, of course, in these kind of situations, in Burma, Myanmar, certainly, we are seeing a large increase, potentially at least over the horizon, of foreign funding. And in that kind of situation, again, there's a danger that donors will be seeking to work with larger organisations, will be trying to offload quite large amounts of money with best possible intentions that could marginalise local activities. So I think it's important in Myanmar, donors are talking about, and already have in other parts of the country, established multi-donor trust funds in order to pool money, in order to avoid aid duplication, and in an effort towards aid harmonisation and coordination. Multi-trust funds, possibly a good way forward, but any kind of donor mechanisms, I believe, must be designed in a way which are flexible enough to engage constructively with local organisations that have limited capacities and probably are not able to bid for large amounts of funding. And I think this is a real challenge to donors upstream and then to downstream aid providers. Can they actually be flexible enough and understanding enough of local realities to respond to these challenges? I think I'll leave it at that, and perhaps if you could bring me in again later, I'd be happy to say some more, but I'll hand it to my colleagues.
Thanks, Ashley. No, those are all very interesting points, and I think the experience of multi-donor trust funds and the multi-donor trust fund in South Sudan is something that we need to learn some lessons from in that regard. There's another question here that I just want to throw on the table before I ask the others to respond, because this is from someone in our online audience, Guy from IRIN News, UN News Agency. What would be the consequences of apparent plans by the GOSS, the government of South Sudan, to embark on the forced disarmament among communities, as voluntary disarmament has not been viewed as successful? So I'm going to, that's another question to add to the mix, and I think I'm going to go over to Simon if you're ready.
Well, I'll go backwards. What would be the implications of forced disarmament? Basically, people in the area I was working in Jonglei, they've been fleeing to the marshes since '91, and they know where to hide weapons when forced disarmament comes along. So I mean, there's actually not physically the presence of government in the villages where the people have the arms to simply swoop on them one day and say, you're going to be disarmed. They'll be off like a shot into the Deutsch and they'll hide their guns, and it'll all go around again. It's more in terms of sorting out the local drivers of conflict rather than the disarmament. And I think the implication of a forced disarmament could just duplicate what happened with the Lao Nur in 5 years ago. Going backwards, the two questions from Chatham House. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. The Malaysia local people being armed. I think there's a difficulty with everybody in all these issues engaging with vigilante activity. It produces as a whole debate about this, and it's beyond my capacity to follow that. What is important, though, and from the point of view of this study, is that it's local agency which is rearming. It doesn't need to come from outside. They asked us that question. We would like that, but in the absence of it coming from aid agencies, they were going to rearm themselves. So I think a whole domain of activities needs to be retained in the area of local agency. They will do what needs to be done, and it costs 7 cows. In terms of Salam Tutu, I think that's a question for Justin to reply to. But I think the mistake that the whole mandated Chapter 7 mandate mandating peacekeepers in the communication of their mandates to local people is that well, those mandates are not communicated to local people. I mean, I was talking to the commissioner of Twitch County, and I just showed him a piece of paper. I said, well, have you seen the UNMISS mandate? And this is the commissioner who's been there for the last 2 years, and he sees UNMISS every day. He said, oh, no, that's great. I didn't realize. I'll tell them about that. The obligation to take the necessary action to protect people in imminent danger, and just can't find peace. So the question is an unrealistic expectation and not being sufficiently honest about the limitations of the peacekeepers, and the fact that once those peacekeepers have been shown to not be a credible fighting force, as the case in Kadugli with the Egyptian peacekeepers, once they've lost their credibility, they lose all credibility in terms of persuasion, in terms of prevention activities, and that's what did happen. And Ashraf Ghazi talked many times about this. We've got to get out there, and we've got to be in villages to show our presence and have some sort of preventative capacity. They never did that. They only set up 10 of their 70 referendum support bases in the counties, and they never left their headquarters. So that whole sort of soft approach that JMC were talking about didn't happen with UNMISS with one S. There are signs that it's improving, and I think we have to look in a positive direction in terms of various encouraging signs of a more flexible deployment with the South Sudan UNMISS, and also a greater engagement with local authorities. And in terms of the question, Virginie Lacroix, I think did we ask if things would have been worse before? We have to be honest about the most difficult question to ask local people is what they think about you. And it's also the question that is going to be most falsified and most unreliable. So you have to see what they do rather than what they necessarily say, and I think that's always been in South Sudan from the days of OLS. People say we would die without more OLS food. When OLS food doesn't come, they don't necessarily die, but that's a protective mechanism to tell the aid workers that they're going to die so that they get more assistance. So that negotiation is not an obvious one.
Oh, thanks, Simon. I'm going to pass over to Niels now, and because we're running out of time, you might want to focus on one or two of the questions that you feel you have something to comment on.
I will, and I'll try to be brief. Following on from Simon, into your question, looking at the Burma, Myanmar Nagi study that I was more closely involved in the actual research, we didn't ask, and for some reasons that Simon just gave, we are all associated with the aid business, and it's with the last one who can get an honest answer to that one. We got around it in sort of indirect ways. I think one thing that came out very clearly in the Nagi studies, I see traces of it in the others, is that the assistance and the contribution to protection that was most appreciated in the post-Nagi study was any kind of aid that left people with more options, more choices, i.e. money, or something you can translate into money, because that again gives you possibilities. That's what you lose when a major disaster hits you. You lose your options, your choices are limited, and they're being fewer and fewer and fewer. And that's one thing I think we really miss out on in the aid business, is seeing ourselves as those which should catalyze people's ability to recover themselves, but by offering them something that then again gives them back some of the options they lost. And that in a sense also takes me to very quickly, Samir, your question. I mean, I agree with you, and I see the danger. We went out into this world with a fairly narrow set of questions, And it's always happened when you then start talk to people who are really wearing the shoes that it's all about, you get a wide range of answers back. So this is more about what we're holding up now is more a reflection of the perceptions of what protection is all about. And that is very wide, and it is, as Justin was hinted before, once you're in that situation, it is extremely interconnected. So we may sit in London or Copenhagen and insist on a more narrow understanding of protection, and that would probably be helpful from an institutional point of view and from an academic point of view, certainly. But again, we would probably then, as Sarah was indicating, just somehow contribute to the disconnect. So I agree with you, but I also think this is just that's what it is. You should have seen the time we spent just finding the right word in Myanmar or in Karen for protection. Just the translation, the difference in answers you get if you ask for threats or challenges is huge. So there's a lot in there.
Thanks, Nils. I'm going to ask Justin and then Sarah to comment on one or two of the questions, but I've got one specifically for them, which comes from one of our online participants. This is from Isaac Musa, who's the Secretary General of Nuba Mountain Solidarity Abroad, UK. And his question is directed to both Justin and Sarah, based on their experience in the field and of conflict in Nuba Mountains. What kind of immediate roles are required from Nuba people in the diaspora to help their people back home in the Nuba Mountains? And how can you use the knowledge of Nuba people in the diaspora in similar studies? So I hand over to Justin first, and then after that, Sarah, to close.
Okay, well, just very quickly, because I think my friends have filled in some of the, most of the questions, but Virginie, in the case of South Kordofan, unfortunately, because it's not always helpful just to bash the UN all the time, but I fear that there's quite a bit of evidence suggests that the way things were set up there, it may have done more harm than good. Both in very practical things, like people running to an area that was meant to be a safe haven to then find that they could get executed in that safe place, to bigger things in that, the research we were doing on the ground a year ago showed that local people saw this war coming. They knew it was coming. Yet when you talked with many of the people within the UN system on the ground, they weren't gearing up for this war at all. They were just focusing on the north-south split. So, the fact that we were investing how many millions a month in that operation, it gave us all a false sense of security. We have a mechanism in place that's looking after South Kordofan, so we can, we've done what we should have done as internationals, and it didn't actually help in that case. Having said that, Simon's right, that there can still be ways forward here, but I think that this issue of a real reform in what the JMC general called industrial UN peacekeeping, which he said in his quote, these huge UN industrial peacekeeping missions, I really do not believe in. And this is a general who's run many of them in his life. Salami, your question, I suppose that's one of the things that's out there. What do we do when insecurity becomes so bad that the existing mechanisms don't work? Yeah. And I think we have to say people start dying in large numbers. We don't have a solution right here now. In terms of trying to be more positive looking forward, this issue of prevention in terms of seeing it coming, and Simon's been talking about this, we could be doing a lot more in the preventative side. But when it actually gets to this awful situation, we're seeing it in Syria as well, and we've seen it in other countries over the last 6 months. I don't know. It's awful. Lots of innocent people die horrible deaths. That's happening in Nuba and other places. Maybe the rest has been covered. Isaac Musa, if you're there. Assalamu alaikum. what could the diaspora do more? Maybe it'd be good to have a chat after the meeting about that. But in terms of, for the general interest of the group, you know, the role of the diaspora in these conflicts is very important. Your remittances can play a huge role in helping local people access resources if there are ways of getting remittances in. And then from the advocacy point of view, in terms of this issue of communicating both with, you know, international decision makers, but also with, in your case, Isaac, the wider public in the north of Sudan, who remain ignorant of what is going on in their own country very often. I think there's more of a role of the diaspora there.
Sarah, would you like to comment on any of the...
Just two additional points, because I think we've covered a lot of ground here. One on, I mean, I think you've been extremely disciplined, Justin, about, you know, talking yes. Very polite about the situation in South Kordofan. There is huge frustration, Justin and I discussed this a lot, you know, in private, about the fact that a lot of, you know, the level of threat in South Kordofan was well understood well before this happened. I don't know if there are still copies outside of a study we did in 2007. It was called The Long Road Home, and it was looking at the reintegration of returnees in South Kordofan. And we put in a tiny section on UMIS, you know, just a page. But actually, there was a lot more. You know, we were not supposed to look at UMIS per se, but it came out so strongly from the study we were doing on the ground about the inadequacy of the mechanism we had in place and the extent to which people felt it. You know, since then we've been doing a number of us, you know, a lot of work with you know, the structures in South Kordofan and in Khartoum at the time, at the level of the peacekeeping mission, as well as agencies, but also with the donors, and we try to kind of, you know, find other mechanisms to try and deal with the level of threat that continue to escalate. Yet the response has been abysmal. I think what's happened in June in South Kordofan leaves us with a lot to, you know, be answered for in terms of an international community that purports itself to be able to provide an element of protection and assistance to threatened communities. And, you know, perhaps one day we'll do a study on what has happened and why, but, you know, it needs to inform how we go forward, or, you know, what's happened there. And, you know, the suffering of people last June would have been completely in vain. The other point was on the diaspora, and, you know, I completely agree with Justin about the role that they could play in terms of, you know, engaging more with people in Sudan more widely. But I think there is another important role, you know, often the diaspora, especially if people haven't been back for a while, tend to have a certain, you know, idea of what things are back home, and the messages that they put out are not always consistent with what people on the ground feel is important for them, is helpful. And it's almost a plea, actually, to the diaspora to, yes, be engaged. Obviously, you know, you do you're part of constituencies in the countries in which you live, and you can mobilize political action, and that political action is very important, but make sure that it is consistent and it is informed by, you know, your relatives back home, because their interests, their needs may be different from how it is seen if you've been away for a long time. And I think that's, you know, quite important as a reminder. Other than that, we're seeing an increasing role of the diaspora in many crisis. I mean, look at Somalia and the extent to which remittances are actually, you know, keeping the assistance going. So there is a huge role that the diasporas already play in general, and that can, I think, it will only become more and more important as we go forward, and responses will continue to become more local. I mean, that was the other point, you know, in response to what Ashley was saying about, you know, whose values and whose systems. The system is shifting already. Responses are becoming increasingly local and increasingly regional, and we need to recognize that. And if we do not more consistently and significantly engage in, you know, those local values, aspirations, and approaches, we will become increasingly irrelevant as an international aid community.
Thank you, Sarah. We're out of time, and so I don't think I'm going to be able to bring Ashley back, other than just to thank him for his participation and his patience in participating via Skype. I'm going to give Nils about 30 seconds, I think, to make some concluding remarks. And I urge you all to stay and join us for a sandwich lunch. Actually, we've got some quite tasty nibbles this time, and an opportunity to talk to the panelists in more detail. So those questions that you didn't have, or comments you didn't have a chance to make. And I'd like to point out we have another author of the study in the audience. Henrik, do you want to raise your hand? So we have. Even though he's not on the panel, he's also one of the co-authors and available to chat with you afterwards. So I'll thank you now for coming to join us today, and please do stay and have some lunch. Nils.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody for being patient with us. Just to say that the Local to Global Protection Initiative, which sort of lies behind the HPN paper here, it's not quite over yet. We didn't really know what we set out to achieve, so we don't really know when to call it a close either.
But
no.
it hasn't even begun.
No, we haven't even begun. No. So we continue we're not very good at log framing and planning, so we'll sort of snowball on with primarily now trying to sort of get the message out locally and globally, wherever it may be relevant. With a focus on talking to colleagues, local NGOs, national aid workers, international aid workers, peacekeepers, on the practical implications of this. I mean, trying to get, as we've already doing now in South Kordofan in some small ways, taking the learnings into actual guidance for practice. So that's our emphasis, and any of you here or out online who's interested, get in touch with us. Again, you'll find the reference to the website, and particularly if your interest is beyond just the mere academic, but if you want to get in touch with us on how this actually can translate into practice, how to turn some of this thinking into something that can help bridge at least a few of these disconnects in a few places, because that's really what we are trying to be about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Nils. Okay, I'm going to bring the session to a close. So thank you again for coming to the presentation. Do take copies of the report. Do spread the word. And HPN will be supporting the Local to Global project with the further dissemination of the report. So thank you very much.
Thank you.